Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCK Week 1 overview and analysis video. Incredibly excited to finally jump in to the summer split here in the LCK to cover a league and a region that isn't the LPL, who started much earlier than everybody else. And we had a very fun, very action-packed first week of the LCK, so a lot of games to get into. Of course, if you're new to the channel, what we do here is we go over every single series that happened in the LCK this week in week number 1, but of course we'll be doing it for the entire split, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages. But if you want to know my thoughts on the league as a whole and maybe the direction that some of these teams are going in, maybe some of where I'm projecting these teams to finish, you can check out the video that's linked up in the iCard right now. That's going to be my primer video that was released about a week ago. Goes over every single team relatively in depth, talking about, again, where I think teams are going to play for, the advantages and the disadvantages that those teams are likely going to have. Not only do I power rank the teams in those videos, I also power rank all of the players within their individual positions. So if you want an in-depth breakdown on, everything LCK going into this split, that video is for you. But in this one, we're going to see how well those takes stood up. So, if you guys are excited, let me know down in the comment section below. What series were you most excited to see, and who did you think was going to be able to come out of week 1 on top? I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback, of course, down below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into the analysis. Like I said, we're going to be covering every single series. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for all best of 3s in this week number 1. Then, of course, at the end of the week, I will give you my updated power rankings as well as my player of the week and my dud of the week here for the entirety of week number 1. So, without further ado, let's jump right into day number 1. And we kick day number 1 off with a pretty intriguing matchup between KT Rolster and Hanwha Liiv Esports that KT Rolster is going to be able to take in 3 games. Really good stuff coming out from them. You wanted to see this team start the split off with a relatively strong start. Definitely you want the momentum to start rolling on KT, and they definitely did that here. It was a little bit of a tale of, 2 teams for both of them, quite frankly, in this series. You had Game 1 and Game 3, which were pretty KT favored. KT looking very dominant, very controlling, having a lot of pressure, making good macro moves. The stuff you want to see out of the team that I had number 3 in my power rankings. And then Game 2, maybe not so much, but, we'll talk about Hanwha Liiv in just a second. For KT Rolster, again, I'm going to have to just kind of treat Game 2 like a little bit of an outlier. It's not particularly surprising that it happened. Not only is KT, known for being relatively, how should I say, inconsistent. That's about the nicest way I can put it. But Hanwha Liiv is one of those teams that could show up any given game. And so to see Game 2 happen, it's not particularly surprising. But Games 1 and 3 were really good from KT Rolster. And they were really good in particular from Cuz in the jungle, who's going to get my player of the series. And again, you might be looking at this saying, like, how can you give Cuz the player of the series? He was horrendous in game number 2. And yes, I agree, he was horrendous in game number 2, but he was by far the biggest factor, in my opinion, in both games 1 and 3 to be able to create a lot of the success that they were able to push forward on. Of course, Keen was really fun in this series. I think BDD had a pretty good series as well, but for me, Cuz was definitely the one that was driving KT Rolster forward, and that was kind of something that started in spring. As much as I love Keen and BDD and the solo lane duo on this team, and as much as I do think that they are probably the better players on this team, Cuz's emergence and really my inability to ignore him anymore has really become a big catalyst for why KT Rolster has jumped up so much in terms of perception, in my opinion. I think he's become pretty inarguably a top 4-ish jungler in the region. Top 3 is relatively difficult to break into. There's just all world-class players, like all top 5 in their role in the world. And so, Cuz definitely, not in that category in my opinion, but still someone that can be strong. Now, it is worth noting that he is relatively inconsistent. He's kind of been that way throughout his entire career, and we saw that in this series. Games 1 and 3 were great. Game 2, not so much. You're gonna get a couple of bad games out of him every so often, but it really does feel like he's limited those plays a lot more, and he's maximized a lot of the synergy that he has with the particular players on this team. We were worried about BDD coming into the year because he was coming off of that 2022 that he had with Nongshim, where everything just kind of felt like a disaster, but, BDD's emergence as an MVP caliber player last split was definitely helped by the fact that him and Cuz have really good synergy together, so it's really good to see that. BDD was, again, very good in this series, especially on the Annie in Games 1 and 3. He was really able to set up, I think, a lot of the plays plays that KT wanted to go for, especially in that game number 3. You have so much setup to try and capitalize for that Aphelios for him to deal damage in the late game, and, you know, I think BDD did a really good job of that. Of course, the Annie can deal a lot of damage on her own as well, so it's not just, you know, a supportive setup style of mid laner, but BDD continues to be strong. Aiming in the hands were definitely good enough. There were moments where they didn't look fantastic, but always funny to see a player get beat on their own skin, which is what happened to Viper in this series with Aiming taking the EDG Aphelios in game number 3. And then Keen was really solid. I thought the Sion game in particular was really good in game number 3, but unfortunately, as much as I love to see the Kayle come out in game number 2, you love to see these more off-the-wall kind of crazy picks. It didn't necessarily work in the same way that they might have wanted it to. They didn't get to that late-game power spike that you were kind of hoping for. So overall, I would say good stuff from KT Rolster, especially Cuz in the jungle, even if game 2 was a little bit up and down. And then for Hanwha, it's basically the exact opposite story. Really bad game 1 and 3, but, you know, game 2 was really good from them. We saw the potential that this roster has kind of been lauded for over the course of the year. They're just not able to put it together over the course of an entire series. Now, it is worth noting they are going into a very good team. I don't want to overreact and say that this team is a disaster, because honestly, they manhandled them a bit in game number 2, taking advantage of Cuz, really controlling the tempo, but they just weren't able to do all that much outside of that. My dud of the series is going to go to Liiv in the support position. Had a pretty good game number 2 on the Blitzcrank. I think Broadcast gave him player of the game, which isn't surprising. If you play Blitzcrank at the professional level, you're probably going to get player of the game from the broadcast. It's pretty much without fail happening every time, but the Milio and the Rakan games were just really, really bad from him. The Rakan in particular in game number 1 was not fun to watch, but you get Milio in game number 3 and you have basically zero impact in lane and on the map. That's not good. That's really, really bad, and that was a concern for this team going into the split, was that Liiv was just not going to be able to hold up. Didn't really have any synergy with Viper across all of spring, and it really doesn't feel like that has upgraded all that much as we move into summer. They're really relying on him to be able to step up, because you need this bot side to be a power point of the map. Viper is your best player, and you need to be able to play through him, but, you know, it wasn't just Viper being able to step up in the series. There were positives in game number 2. Zeka had a really good game 2 on the Gragas. Viper was good on the Jinx. Klid had a much better game number 2 on the Vi. Like, there were positive moments here, but then you look at games 1 and 3, and you're like, Zeka was atrocious in game number 3 on the Gragas. He went from arguably one of the most influential players in the entire game in game 2 to arguably the worst player in the entire game in game 3. And then Viper was just kind of not nearly as useful as the Aphelios on the other side in that final game. Klib got out jungled in both of the games that they lost, especially in terms of early pressure, which is definitely going to be an issue. And then Kingen on the top side was fine, really not creating a lot of pressure, not really being a problem. That's Kingen. That's what he's going to do. He's going to be relatively weak side. But overall, Hanwha still has a lot of things they need to figure out. I like this team. I like the way they're constructed. And game 2 does give me hope that there's something there. But man, just they're so rough around the edges that it's difficult to predict this team to be able to move far. And then KT Rolster on the other side. This team's good. I'm still not completely convinced that they're going to be, you know, one of the top 2 teams in the league, a finals team, but we've seen this team grow a lot over the course of the past couple of months. We know that BDD and Keen in particular, as 2 carries, can step up and be, you know, players that carry your team across the finish line. Aiming in the hands are more than solid in the bot lane. And if Cuz is going to have really good games like this, if he's going to be able to control the early game and set up plays for a lot of the rest of his laners like he did on the Volley Bear in game number 3, then KT is going to be a really, really dangerous team. It wasn't a perfect showing from them, but it was good enough for me to consider them in a pretty good spot. And then moving on to our second series here of day number 1, and it's another decently intriguing matchup. 2 of the first round exits from the spring split. We had Dplus KIA taking on Liiv SANDBOX, and DK is able to pick up the 2-0 series win, and it was not particularly close. Game number 1, an absolute rout. Game number 2, pretty much the same. A little bit more competitive, I would say, but certainly not by a lot. It was just a brutal series for SANDBOX. We'll get into why I think it ended up happening to them, but we gotta give a lot of credit to DK, and first and foremost, it looks like they're back. Canyon, Showmaker, the jungle mid duo that has terrorized the LCK for many years now. It feels like we are getting a good version of them again, a better version than we've seen in the last few splits for sure, because those 2 absolutely dominated this series. They were unstoppable as a duo. Canyon in both games 1 and 2. In game 1 on the Viego, more so as the carry, someone who was going to be dealing a lot of damage. And then game 2, just setting up this Aurelion Soul, which absolutely obliterated SANDBOX. It wasn't particularly close. Great from him, but my player of the series is going to go to Showmaker in the mid lane for that A-Soul game number 2. Just a ridiculous amount of damage coming out from that dragon. Really not a lot that, SANDBOX can do at the point where he's just super fed. Going into something like a Jace, you really need to be able to win early if you're Jace, or else you're just doomed. A-Soul's going to perma outscale you, and by the time Showmaker was even like midway through this game, he was already incredibly accelerated, incredibly fed, and at that point, there's just nothing on the side of SANDBOX that has any sort of answer to him, and they really showed that off. Showmaker was awesome down the stretch of Spring Split. People sometimes forget that, but he was arguably the best mid laner in the region for the last 3-ish weeks of that split, even if he wasn't all that good at the beginning of it, which gave me hope that he was going to be able to come into summer and be, pretty good as well. Obviously, playoffs wasn't great for him, but you thought, maybe that stretch of time where he was really good was going to be sustainable, and at least in this first series, it absolutely looks like that's going to translate here into summer. This looks like prime Showmaker, and it looked like prime Canyon as well. Like I said, really good on the Viego, really good on the Maokai, 2 very different playstyles. In terms of what he wanted to do, he was much more of the focal point for a lot of the aggression in game number 1, and then game number 2, he was kind of setting up the rest of his team to be able to capitalize on that aggression, and he played both styles incredibly well. This is the problem with Canyon, is he really doesn't have a bad champion, a bad playstyle, a bad way to go about the game, and it's really hard to play into a player like that who can do everything at such a high level. There's really not a lot of easy outs. They were far from the only 2 people on the team, though, to play well. Kana was just by far the better top laner against Bertle in this series. Relatively expected if everything else on the map is going wrong, but definitely worth noting. And then Defton Kellen, definitely the better bot lane. They played early game bot lanes. This is what they were doing at the beginning of the year when DK looked really, really good at the beginning of spring, when we're like, they're definitely a top 2 team. It was because they were playing a lot of early game bot lanes, trying to get that mid game power spike and playing through Defton Kellen. And they did that again here. The Draven coming out in game 1, the Lucian Nami coming out in game number 2. So a lot of early power, a lot of early aggression. And we'll get to it. Liiv SANDBOX actually invested a lot of resources into trying to get their bot lane ahead, but Defton Kellen were just better in this series, and especially in the isolated 2v2, it wasn't particularly close. And so DK just showing that, quite frankly, they're the better team in this series, and it's something that I would expect them to continue to do throughout the rest of the year. And then for SANDBOX, I mean, not good. Like, this was a disastrous way to start your split. You were really hoping that the addition of Teddy would actually unlock and influence a lot of the rest of this map, but they actually played a style that I was very surprised in. When we were talking about him in the primer, one of the big reasons why I liked Teddy's addition to this team was that I thought he was going to be a relatively good weak side bot laner. You have a lot of players on this team that like resources. Closer, Bertle, even Willer to an extent, like to have those resources in the early to mid game, and Teddy is more comfortable, I would say, farming up into the late game, trying to get into those power spikes towards the back half of the game, than he is being this big, resource carry in the bot lane. But that's not how Liiv SANDBOX saw this first series, because they invested a ton of resources into this bot lane trying to get Teddy ahead. And, to his credit, he was easily the best player on the team, at least in terms of performances, but he was also given by far the most in terms of everybody on this team. I think maybe if the rest of the map held up a little bit better, it could have been a little bit of a different conversation, but that wasn't the case. Teddy got those resources, wasn't able to carry the game hard enough because the rest of the map lost, and that's going to bring me to my dud of the series, which has to go to Closer in the mid lane, who was just miserable, especially in game number 2. Closer, somebody who I've been lower on over the course of his career. His inconsistencies in the mid lane have really prevented me from ever saying that he's going to be a top mid laner in the LCK like I think a lot of other people really want him to be, and this series is a prime example of that. You're given the Jace into Aurelion Soul matchup, and you lose early, and that's a disaster. There's no way to come back from that. There is literally nothing you can do from that point onwards. He wasn't the only player, I should say, on this team who played bad in this series, but I think his underperformances going into Showmaker were the most noticeable, and certainly the ones that stood out the most. As for Bertle and Willer on the top side, they also got pretty hard outclassed. Bertle was just not on the same level as Kana in this series, playing a couple of more passive picks. Like I said, it's going to happen when the rest of the map kind of folds under itself, but he wasn't great in the top lane. Willer just got out-jungled at every conceivable turn. He was trying to make plays on the Vi and on the Sejuani, trying to set up the rest of his team, but look at the comps, like, once the Jace gets behind, like, where exactly are you going to go with that pressure in the early game? And so Willer didn't have a lot of avenues, and then he kind of just gave up. It really felt like there wasn't a lot of things that he wanted to do in the mid game once this team was super far behind. And like I said, Teddy and Kale had moments where they looked okay because they received a ton of pressure in the early game, but you know, they were never going to be able to keep up with an Aurelion Sol and a Maokai in game 2 or even the Viego in game number 1. There just wasn't going to be a lot of options if they weren't able to actually generate that lead coming out of the bot lane. And so overall, really was not pleased with what I saw from SANDBOX. Very concerning to see that, you know, if you want to play for Teddy and Kale, that's great, but you have to convince the rest of the players on the team to be able to play without resources, or at the very least to be able to survive 1v1, which they weren't able to do in this series. And so I'm not sure if this is a playstyle that I expect them to go to continuously, but it did not work here in the first series. And then for DK on the other side, I mean, this is about as good of a start to the split as you can possibly have. Canyon and Showmaker look completely online. Deft and Kellen are going back to that style that very much worked for them and kind of looked good on the top side. Basically everything kind of coming into place here. I predicted them to be much better than they were in spring. This should be a team that has top 2, top 3 upside, and at least in the first series here, they definitely showed that that is the case. Moving on now to day number 2, though. We get to kick off our third series of the week, and it's a pretty interesting one. Two teams that I think are relatively close in terms of skill level. We have a matchup between the Kwangdong Freecs and DRX that KDF is going to be able to take in 2 games. Now, game number 1, very close, pretty back and forth, took quite a while for KDF to be able to close it out, but they are able to get game 2 done in a lot more clean fashion, and honestly, this team looks really, really good in their first series of the year. A couple of roster changes that I didn't predict here in my pre-split primer video. June is going to be starting at the support position. He was benched towards the back half of spring. He did end up coming in and playing a little bit. Him and Moham, you know, kind of split time, I would say, over the course of spring split. So they want to go with June to start the split, but, you know, we'll see. It'll probably be more of a rotation just like it was in spring. I don't see either of those guys, you know, dominating the job. And then Kiehu's actually going to be coming in and playing in the mid lane for DRX, which I think is a really interesting choice. Fate is out. Kiehu as a player, pretty interesting. Got to watch quite a bit of him watching Paddock this past split and, you know, trying to get film onto him. Kiehu was on that team as well, but, you know, all the complaints that I gave about Paddock in the bot lane, you can multiply those times 10 in terms of Kiehu and what he was offering. Paddock, a player who really hasn't had a ton of experience even at the tier 2 level. Kiehu's a player who's not had any experience at the tier 2 level. So DRX has done this in the past. We saw this, I believe, in 2021 with this team promoting a ton of players from their academy team and not from their challengers team, which not a lot of other teams are doing. And so pretty high risk. It could be high reward if those players end up working out. Obviously, not necessarily working out in this first series, but for KDF, really like what we saw from them in this series. Player of the series for me is going to go to Dudu on that top side. There's really nothing else that I can say about him that I haven't already said. He has consistently been better than anybody could expect. Basically, every split of his career, he has been one of the more interesting players on every team that he's played for. I talked about him a lot last year on Hanwha Life, a team that really had no direction, if we're being entirely honest. And this year, maybe outside of Bulldog, he's definitely been the best player on KDF, and he continued to do that here. A great game 1 on the Cassante, a great game 2 on the Gwen. He was just better than Rascal in this series, and honestly, that's super impressive. As much as Rascal has been struggling over the course of this year, I know obviously he still has a lot of defenders. Go on to, you know, any social media platform, you'll see people saying that Rascal is the best player on this team. He certainly hasn't performed like it over the course of the year, but I can understand that the talent is definitely still there, but Dudu honestly was just better than him in this series, and it wasn't particularly close. Great 1v1ing skills in the top lane, and man, his team fighting is incredibly consistent. He's just a really good player. Somebody who absolutely makes everybody around him look a lot better, but he wasn't the only one who played well. I gotta give credit to this bot lane. Taiyun and June actually had a pretty good series overall. They were certainly going into a bot lane that has a lot of controversy surrounding them, a lot of question marks going into the split with Paddock, you know, not necessarily being the most established of ADCs, and Beryl coming off of a pretty horrendous split in spring, which, you know, again, not surprising if you watched the LCK regular season last year as well, but Taiyun and June were pretty solid. Taiyun in particular in game number 2 on the Zeri was dealing a lot of damage in those teamfights, was receiving a lot of resources on the side of KDF, and was actively paying them back out, which is a really important thing to see. They were maybe the worst bot lane in the LCK in spring, and so to see them at least start off the split with a pretty good performance, I think is definitely encouraging. And if June is going to play like this on the Recon, be aggressive, be able to set up plays, he's definitely the right choice. Obviously, Moham was a little bit better, I think, in spring, but you've got two supports there. One of them's got to land, and at least in this first series, that was the case. Mid-jungle, ironically, for KDF, was probably the least important part of this series, which is super good for them because Bulldog was by far their best player in spring and somebody who I think a lot of people saw having some major upside for this KDF team, somebody who could, you know, theoretically be a top 4-ish mid in the LCK one day. He didn't really need to be that in this series, which was really good. He was playing support. He was, you know, on the Talia, on that shove and roam style of gameplay, and he played the role well, but he didn't need to be the big damage carry, which is a really, really good sign for the team overall. Youngjae is somebody who I've been concerned about in the past, but, you know, the engagers, the more, I guess, supportive style, not carry-oriented junglers definitely working for him in this series. Interesting to note, we're seeing a lot of prio on the volley bear in the LCK that we're just not seeing in any other region right now. It'll be interesting to see if that translates into the West, but, you know, interesting stuff from KDF, and you gotta be really excited from what you saw out of the top and bot lanes in particular. And then for DRX on the other side, again, you were going to be really interested to see how this team ended up showing up because they disappointed so much in spring with the talent that they had, and now they're bringing in two really, I mean, quite frankly, completely unestablished players to play in their two carry roles in mid and AD carry, and you really needed to see how they adapt, and there was some good and some bad. I don't think anybody on this team was horrendous throughout the entire series, but my dud of the series is going to go to KIA in the mid lane. I just didn't think he was all that consistent on the Ahri. Certainly the damage wasn't there, which, you know, sometimes is going to be okay, but Bulldog was significantly more active on the map, was definitely getting the better of him in a lot of the laning phases, and I can't really remember a standout play that he made, which is, you know, something I really can't say for the rest of this team. Paddock and Beryl had good moments. Paddock in game number 1 was keeping them alive, even if he was trying to frontline on the Aphelios, because the dude is an absolute maniac. You know, we'll talk about him a little bit later, and I think a lot of people want to give dud of the series to Krako, but I think that's more off of reputation than anything. He wasn't particularly good in spring. Obviously, a lot of people want to see Juhan, but Krako was a big reason they were in game number 1 on the Kazakhs, and so, you know, I don't want to, you know, criticize him too hard. I actually don't think he was really all that bad in this series. To me, solo laners definitely fell behind in terms of DRX. Rascal didn't have a particularly great series, but he was playing Sion on weak side without a lot of assistance, and, you know, you're going to be able to lose to Gwen in that matchup, which is really just not a matchup that you're supposed to win. And then, of course, Paddock had a ridiculous amount of gold in game number 1, and he kind of threw that game away, and then he was just kind of bad in game number 2. The dude positions like he's not an AD carry. Like, I don't know if that's something that he was able to get away with at the academy level, at the tier 3 level in the Korean scene, but it's something he's certainly not going to be able to get away with at the LCK level. The dude sometimes loses his mind in team fights, flashes forward, gale forces forward, and tries to frontline on the Aphelios, and it's just not going to work. That champion doesn't work like that anymore. We've clearly seen that around the world. The champion doesn't have a great win rate anyways, and, you know, playing him like that is certainly not going to increase it, and so definitely something that I would hope that he'd be able to rein in, because his aggression is pretty good outside of that. He just goes a little bit overboard with it sometimes, but Kieho was fine. Again, I don't want it to come across like I hated his performance. I thought it was just generally the least spectacular, and then the rest of the team couldn't really keep up. I still think there's upside for DRX, but man, you know, if Kieho and Paddock in particular are going to play like they did in this series, the upside for this team could be immense. Like, I could see them being able to take down basically anybody in the league if Paddock in particular has a good game, but also no lead is safe on the side of this DRX team, because it really feels like a team that is going to completely flip every game. And then for KDF on the other side, I honestly feel pretty good about this team. Ranking them at the top of that bottom 4 cluster feels pretty good right about now. Obviously, SANDBOX not looking great in their first series. This could be a slot where KDF could, you know, potentially continue to improve and try to get into those top 6 spots, but it's going to be hard to say that without them beating some of the top teams first. Of course, the bottom 4 definitely still kind of established, and DRX not exactly the toughest opponent, but if you're looking for positives, you got them for KDF. Taiyun and Dudu playing really well. June looking pretty good on the Rakan, and Bulldog not needing to be a super hyper carry for this team to win, I think are all major factors, you know, in contributing to the fact that I feel pretty good about this team after the first series. And then moving on to our second series here of day number 2. Another intriguing matchup because it's between two teams that I have near the bottom of my power rankings. In fact, in the bottom 2 slots in my power rankings. We have a matchup between OK BRION and NS RedForce that Nongshim is able to take. My number 10 team in the power rankings coming out swinging and getting their first win of the season in their first series, which is really, really good from them. We'll talk about Bro in a second, how not impressed I was with their performances and how really concerned I am for this team's outlook over the course of this season, but For now, of course, let's go ahead and start with Nongshim and talk about the advantages and the good things that we saw out of them in this series. Game 1 wasn't particularly great, but honestly, they were pretty consistent across games 2 and 3, which I think is always really what you want to see. It's okay to drop one game here and there, you know, nobody's going to be perfect in League of Legends, but being able to pick up those 2 final wins and being able to win this first series of the year, I think is a really, really good sign, especially in the way that they did it, because it was a lot of the players that are returning from this team that were able to step up and have pretty good series. My player of the series is going to go to Vital in the bot lane. Really liked what we saw out of him, especially in that game number 3 on the Zeri. Of course, just really consistent towards the back half of that game. People are going to sit there and say, well, they got Zeri Yuumi. Of course they were able to win, but look at game number 1. Zeri Yuumi can lose. There are disadvantages to that lane, even if there aren't many, right? There aren't a ton of ways to be able to capitalize on them. There are still ways to be able to beat them in the end, and, you know, we saw that in game 1, but game 3, I think they executed it a lot better. Vital was playing super aggressive towards the back half of the game, really using his gold advantage to be able to try and stop Bro from being able to play the game really at all, and honestly, it succeeded. It was really, really good at asserting that pressure that they needed. And of course, that damage that comes out from that Zeri when she's ahead is absurd. But you got to give credit to Vital for being able to pull that off. He was by far the most important member of this team in this series. And you could say a similar thing about this roster over the course of the spring split, where Vital was definitely the one I think people were looking towards as kind of the player that needed to step up to be able to get Nongshim across the finish line. But really, it didn't feel like Nongshim had a carry in the spring split. You were looking at Din in a couple of games being all right, Vital in a couple of games being all right, but you brought Quad in the mid lane here to be able to try and solidify this position, to be able to try and give you a new avenue, a new lane to be able to play for. And, you know, we'll talk about Quad in a second. I actually think he was very positive for this team in this one, but Vital and Peter being able to step up in the bot lane, not only be able to generate their own leads, but be able to turn them into advantages in the mid to late game that can close out games. That's super important. And if they're going to be able to do that more consistently, they're just not the 10th best team in the league. But like I said, Quad was also really good in this series. 2 games of Cassiopeia, really, really fun to see, especially going into Karis, who is a little bit more of that control mage player. And so Quad being able to take advantage of that stylistic matchup a little bit more. Liked what we saw out of him. Definitely not the, like, hyper-aggressive player that he was on DRX. That may have just more been kind of a team environment thing for him, but still a really big positive for the team. Sylvie was a lot better. I hope that those two start to develop a nice chemistry. Din was a wild man, taking some Bouse lessons on the Scion in game 2, even on the Aatrox in game number 1. A couple of really funny things. And then Peter got to play Yuumi and Milio the entire series, so of course, he looked relatively good. Overall, just good stuff for Nongshim. And then for Bro, on the other side, dud of the series was a super easy choice for me. It's going to go to Effort in the support position. We just talked about Peter getting to play Yuumi and Milio all series and looking pretty good doing it. Well, how do you play Milio and Yuumi in games 2 and 3 and go a combined 0-6-1? Like, how does that even happen? How do you even get to that point? Effort is a clear choice for dud of the series for me. He's been the worst support in the league for 2 years now, and I'm shocked that he still has a job. I don't mean to be rude about that, but just like, man, he has not been able to perform at this level really at all over the course of his career ever since he left the really good teams that he was on, and it's continuously proven over and over again that he's really not a positive. Game 1 was all right, but a lot of that was Henna actually playing really well on the Aphelios in that game number 1. Want to give him credit for that. If Effort is going to continue to just be the worst support in the league in a meta where the supports are like ridiculously broken and incredibly strong in both early and late portions of the game, that's going to be an issue for Bro in terms of whether or not they're actually going to be able to win games. He wasn't the only one who played bad, though. Karis was also not very good in this series. I've been much lower on Karis. I think he really just has proven that he's not an LCK caliber mid laner. He's been given a lot of opportunities at this level. No matter how well he played a couple of years ago in the Challengers League, you know, if you're not going to be able to perform, like, it doesn't matter. You know, he wasn't very good last year, and he hasn't been very good this year either. And so, definitely a disappointing combo there of your support and mid laner, kind of 2 positions that you really need to step up right now. Henna was good in game 1, but definitely was out-pressured by Vital throughout the rest of the series, and and Morgan were fine, I guess. Morgan actually had some good moments in the top lane onto Din, and I certainly don't think was the problem of this team, but very much feels like Spring Bro all over again, where the weak links of this team are standing out in a negative way, and causing them to not really be able to win games. This team has some talent, I guess, like not crazy amounts of upside in Morgan and who we kind of know what they are, but the weak links of this team, Karis, Effort, even Henna to an extent, they're just not going to be good enough for this team to be all that competitive at the LCK level, and that seems to be a trend that will continue on here in summer. And then for Nongshim, they're probably not the worst team in the league with this win, which is a good thing to see. Vital and Peter looked solid. Sylvie had a much better series, but you're going to need to do a lot more than beating Bro in order for me to feel confident that this team has grown all that much from spring. They were the worst team last split, and I really do think that there still is a lot of movement that needs to go on for them to completely erase that ideology. But at least in this first series, I think they did everything they needed to do. All the players looked relatively good playing the style that they feel most comfortable playing. They have an identity, and as long as they can stick to that and continue to grow as a group, I do think that this team has, upside to not be one of the bottom 2 teams in the league. Moving on to day number 3 now, and honestly, day 3 was a really fun day in terms of games, really only top action, and we kicked that off between a matchup between KT Rolster and Gen.G, that Gen.G is able to take in 3 games. The defending champions entering the LCK summer split with not as much confidence as they probably left the spring split with after MSI. Coming in 4th place at the tournament is certainly not what the LCK's #1 seed probably wanted, but at least they're back on track here in the beginning of summer. Really good series coming out from them. Obviously, losing game 1 was not great. They kind of got bounced in game number 1. A really good game from KT Rolster, but some wild shenanigans happening in game 2. A ridiculous pause coming in, and a really unfortunate set of scenarios for aiming, having to sell, obviously, Static Shiv mid-game, losing out on, like, 900 gold, basically for nothing, and then them being able to lose that. I'm not entirely sure it would have changed the outcome of that game, but it certainly looked like it tilted the players at least a little bit, and then game 3 was just an absolute slaughter. Games 2 and 3 were not close at all, so some controversy, at least a little bit, surrounding this series, but I think for the most part, Gen.G definitely showing that they are the team that we all kind of thought they were, and the players on this team are the players we thought they were as well. My player of the series is going to go to Chovy in the mid lane. He was spectacular on that Gragas in the last 2 games of this series. The amount of damage that champion can do when played correctly is actually absurd. Obviously, there's a reason he's been able to function as a solo laner for quite a long time, even without a ridiculous amount of resources, and that's because the base damage that he's able to put out is insane, and the amount of utility he offers as well is great. And when you have a player like Chovy, who's going to be maximizing the amount of damage he's able to get out of a champion like that, obviously he's going to look like an absolute menace like he did in this series. Chovy's a really good player. Obviously, we all know this. I had him as my #1 mid laner. You can make the obvious argument that he's the #1 player in the LCK. I don't think that there's going to be a lot of people that can really dispute that. KIA is obviously in that conversation as well, but Chovy is maybe the most talented player in the entire world, and so not really all that surprising to see him play as well as he did here. Peanut also had a really good series, both on the more supportive picks that he's more used to and are more known for, and also the Kindred in game number 3, something that we really don't see from a player like Peanut all that much anymore. He's kind of moved away from these more aggressive style junglers, but the Kindred absolutely looked good. Dominated that game number 3, was way ahead of Cuz in terms of tempo and pressure, and that's exactly what you want to see again. When this jungle mid duo is clicking, when Peanut and Chovy are both playing at a high level, this team's going to be nearly impossible to take down. Pays and Delight were also really good, pulling out the Twitch in game number 3. This is a long-time Zeri counter. I'm really surprised to not see Twitch more in the pro scene. Obviously, I know he's a little bit feast or famine, can be a little bit weak in the early game, has his issues, but I think he does go into Zeri relatively well, especially when you've got something like the Yuumi available to you. It synergizes incredibly well and can become a very dangerous duo. Pays being able to pull it out here and playing really well on it. Obviously, the Yuumi is a big part of why that pick ends up working, but still worth noting that when you have the opportunity to pick it, it might not be the worst thing in the world to play as a counter to what most people consider to be the strongest AD carry in the game right now. And then Doran was serviceable on the top side. Had some moments where he didn't look particularly good, especially in that game number 1 where Keen kind of brutalized him, but definitely rallied back around, got the Jax in the last few games, and looked a lot better in that one. So Gen.G looking good overall. And then for KT, on the other side, it could have been worse. It absolutely could have been worse. They looked really good in game number 1. Honestly, they dominated game number 1. They absolutely went out there and brutalized Gen.G. Keen, dominated Doran on the top side on that Jax, looked really good on that pick. Obviously, would be a very big pick over the course of the entire series. BDD played really well basically the entirety of this series on the Annie and even on the Ahri in game number 3. It wasn't as good, but still pretty good. Aiming without, taking into exception game number 2 where he had to sell his first item for much less gold because of a stupid bug that Riot refuses to disable. He played pretty well outside of that, I would say. If he could have been a little bit more in game number 3, but that's kind of nitpicky. And then Lehen's, not necessarily on champions that you would consider Lehen's picks, but still being relatively okay. The one player that I think genuinely got outplayed in this series, especially towards the back half and in game number 3 in particular, is going to be Cuz in the jungle, who I was just praising, obviously said he was really good, but he's going up against one of those top 3 junglers that I said he really wasn't on the same level as, and Peanut here. And it definitely showed towards the back half of this series. The pathing was pretty poor. He was down in the early game a lot towards the back half of the series on the Volibear, on the Maokai, on a lot of these picks that need, setup in order to be good, or are the setup that needs to be successful in order for the team to be able to function, and that's going to be a little bit of a problem. Again, Cuz is a little bit hit or miss. He's going to have good games, he's going to have bad games, but that Maokai game in game 3, that gank in the bot lane basically lost them the game, which was super unfortunate, but it's going to happen every once in a while. You're not going to be able to win them all, but overall for KT, I still think they're a good team. Losing to Gen.G certainly does not make you a bad team, but, winning that game number 1, it actually does inspire some confidence in me. Hopefully they weren't tilted too hard from whatever the hell happened in game number 2 with that bug and those issues, because this is a really talented team and one that I think definitely deserves that number 3 spot. They came very close to being able to deal with Gen.G. They just couldn't get over the hump, and the last couple of games definitely needed some things to clean up. And then for Gen.G on the other side, at least you were able to walk out of your first series here with a win. That's definitely going to be the positive, but again, also things you need to clean up. Doran on the top side definitely needs more assistance, I would say, to be able to survive against like the best top laners in the world, like Keen is, and even if Peanut and Chovy are playing really well, this team isn't always a guarantee win against the best teams in the world, like KT Rolster has the potential to be. Pays and Delight are solid, and especially if they're going to be able to pull out these more aggressive picks like the Draven, like the Twitch, I think that's going to be good for them overall, but definitely still some question marks. There's a reason this team does come in at number 2 and not at number 1, but at the very least, you're going to be walking out of the series with a win. And then moving on to our second series here of day number 3, and it's another really interesting clash with a really good team making their split debut. We have T1 taking on Hanwha Liiv Esports, and T1 does pick up the victory. Another 3-game set here coming out from the 2 teams that ended up making finals last split. Not Hanwha, but Gen.G and T1 both going 3 games, but both being able to pick up wins in their debut series. Good for T1 here, obviously. They looked pretty good at MSI, but not the result that they were expecting. Not being able to make finals, I think, was definitely a little bit disappointing for this roster, but they wanted to come back to the LCK and really ramp up. I had them as my number 1 team going into the split. I think they're definitely the most talented team in the LCK. They just have to be able to put it together, and in the Series 1, at the very least, it did kind of look good. Now, it wasn't perfect. There were certainly some moments that didn't look all that great, but at the end of the day, being able to pick up the win, that's really the important part, and I think their main players, the players that really they rely on a lot, being Faker and KIA, definitely stepped up here. Faker is going to get my player of the series. He's continuing right where he left off at the end of spring, where he was legitimately an MVP finalist for me, a really, really good player for T1, one of the most important players to his team in the entire league, maybe one of the best splits he's ever had, and if you can get that again out of Faker, you're going to be a very good team. It's a great start from him, a really good Cassante game to set up a lot of plays in game 2, and then the Ahri was just everywhere on the map in game 3. Doesn't necessarily show in his scoreline, but his performance definitely was indicative of him playing really, really well. Again, if he's going to be super explosive, if he's going to be able to be kind of the main initiator, the main engager for T1, I think that's going to be a big positive for this team. Talked a lot last split about how Faker and KIA being the 2 big playmakers for the team made them the best team in the league for a majority of that split, and I think if those 2 continue to play at the level that they did, even remotely last split, it's going to be fine. Really good stuff from Faker here, and KIA was awesome. Again, 2 games of Milio towards the back half of the series that were both really good. Got to control the tempo a lot, especially in the bot lane. That can be really good into Zeri Yuumi, obviously. 2 games of Zeri Yuumi coming out from Hanwha Liiv, and both being losses. Reddit, not a single comment about that because, of course, when Zeri Yuumi wins, they're going to complain, and when they lose, no one says a single word. It's just kind of how it is. When the narrative is disrupted, nobody actually cares. But, KIA playing really well on the Milio. That champion is ridiculously busted in the hands of some of the best players in the world, as we saw here. Guma followed up on it, I would say, relatively well. Guma also played well. A little bit of a travesty that this team continues to put him on Jhin in a couple of these games. He got to play it in game 1 and just did not have the same kind of pressure he needed to in order to be able to actually win a lot in the late game. Poor Guma ends up having to take so many concessions for this team, but when he's allowed to play even something like Aphelios, which can carry, he's going to be a really good player. He's one of the best AD carries in the world. He just doesn't always get a chance to show it. Oner and Zeus were fine. Oner had a couple of good games here, but wasn't perfect throughout this entire series. I did like his game 3 on the Kazakhs, though. That was definitely his best game, and then Zeus was fine as well. Definitely more of a secondary role here here in this one, not necessarily going to be the focal point, but that's okay for a top laner. Every once in a while, you're allowed to just kind of be left on an island, and you don't necessarily have to be the better top laner out of the two in order to win, and so good stuff from T1. I would say overall, Faker and KIA continue to be the main stars of this team, though. And then for Hanwha, on the other side, it's the same old story. This team went 0-1 in their first series. You know, Klid and Liiv didn't look particularly good, and guess what? They lose again here. They're 0-2 to start the year with Klid and Liiv not playing particularly well, even when the rest of this team really is kind of stepping up right now. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Klid in the jungle. He flips the game so frequently. It's actually insane. Those two Viego games were so aggressive when he really didn't have the opportunity to do that. There were so many opportunities for him to just scale up and play into the late game and play with his laners who are generating their advantages, but he needs to be the hero or he needs to be the villain. That's just the playstyle that Klid is going to adopt, and I think, you know, like I said last split a lot, Hanwha Life is going to either, you know, feast or flourish because of that. Like, they're either going to be great or they're going to suck, depending on whether or not Klid can actually get ahead. When Klid wins, he looks like a great jungler and this team dominates. When Klid loses, they're not going to win games. They're just not going to be able to keep up, and unfortunately, this was not a particularly good series for Klid. I think Life was also pretty bad, not necessarily creating advantages on the Yuumi. He just doesn't look all that proficient on the champion, if I'm being entirely honest, but him and Viper actually had pretty good laning phases. You know, the Zeri Yuumi was doing relatively well, at least isolated, but not being able to carry on those two champions is a little bit of a concern. I know a lot of people are really high on Viper, and, you know, I was kind of pumping the brakes on him being, like, definitively the best AD carry last split when everybody was like, he's dragging this team across the finish line. It didn't feel like that was the case for me, and I think I'm going to continue to feel that way. I still ranked him as the #1 ADC going into this split because of the talent, but he's got to be able to carry games like this. These are opportunities that he's going to need to be able to step up in. I do want to give a shout out to Zeka. I actually thought Zeka was really good in this series. Really, really fun to watch. The Ahri game in game #1 was really spectacular from him. He always plays really well into Faker. It just seems to be a matchup he feels very comfortable in as a player, but unfortunately not able to get the job done. And Kingen was honestly pretty good as well. Playing the tank matchup most of the series, he was much more stable, in my opinion, than Zeus was on the top side, not necessarily running into nearly as many problems. And so, overall, I would say Hanwha has some positives, but for the most part, again, is the exact same team that they were in spring. They're going to live or die by this jungle position, and unfortunately, in this series, it wasn't good. As for T1 on the other side, they're pretty much the same team we thought they were going to be, and the same team they were in spring, where Faker and KIA are kind of driving this team forward, whereas everybody else is still performing well because of the opportunities that are created by the rest of this team. Guma has the ability to beat anybody in the league when he is on. Owner's still a really good jungler, especially when he's on a more carry-oriented style like he was on the Kazakhs in Game 3. And Zeus, while he is going to have his hiccups every once in a while, is still a phenomenal team fighter, and is still going to be a positive towards the team overall. And so, good stuff from Team 1. They look really good in their opening series, and I think I feel pretty justified, at least at the moment, ranking them #1. And then moving on now to day #4, and day 4 was a little bit of an interesting one. We had some top teams in day 3. It's time to move down to some of the less kind of defined teams, I would say. We had a nice matchup to kick off day 4 between Liiv, SANDBOX, and NS RedForce that SANDBOX is able to take. They're able to pick up their first win of the season here in their second series. It's a 2-0 win, and both games were relatively dominant, and this isn't a particularly surprising outcome. SANDBOX have kind of been the gatekeepers of the upper 6, the playoff teams, if you will. They aren't really all that competitive against any of the teams that I would consider in the top 5, but they seem to pretty consistently be able to beat all of the teams in the bottom 4, and that continues here, and they looked really dominant doing so. You know, obviously this team does have upside. The addition of Teddy, I think, is a net positive for this team by a lot, and I think that there are a lot of good players on this team. They just need to be able to get those good performances out against players that they aren't just better than, right? You've got to be able to perform against the best players in the world as well here in the LCK, but in this particular series, they did everything they needed to do, and they walk away with a win. My player of the series is going to go to Willer in the jungle. I think a lot of people are going to give this to Teddy because of his scoreline, but for me, watching these games, it was Willer who really impressed me. For SANDBOX, it was the pathing early on. It was completely taking Sylvie out of the game in both games, really, especially game #1, but really, it was both games, and just kind of taking over the map. I think that's a really difficult thing to do in the LCK in particular because these teams just have really good macro just kind of inherently, but that's something Nongshim has struggled with in the past. They've been pretty good at skill checking opposing teams, but playing cohesive, macro, slow-paced League of Legends has not necessarily been their strong suit, and I think SANDBOX definitely exploited that here. Willer was just a lot of fun to watch. He's continuing his really good spring, his breakout in spring. Obviously, we can make fun of Hanwha forever for just kind of letting him go. That was a really funny thing to have happen, and not playing him last year, all the crazy things that ended up happening, but he really is a very good jungler here for SANDBOX, an organization that quite frankly, has consistently produced really good junglers. But, Teddy and Kale were also phenomenal. You're looking at their score lines, and you have to wonder when we're going to talk about them. I'm going to talk about them now. The Zeri Yuumi was awesome, but the Jinx Milio was just as good. Again, very funny. Nobody complaining about Zeri Yuumi when they lost both games in the previous series that we discussed, but go to the post-match thread on this one, and of course, there's people complaining about Zeri Yuumi and even Jinx being ridiculously overpowered. It's just how it is. When a champion wins, it looks good. When it loses, it looks bad. People are going to have those opinions, but Teddy and Kale absolutely deserve the credit for being able to win as hard as they did in this series. Teddy is just hyper consistent. He's probably been the best player on this team through week 1, at least across both series, and he really capitalized on a lot of the pressure that was created from Willer incredibly well. That's something that I think we worried about with this team was the passive playstyle that I think Teddy has kind of gathered, rightfully or not, over the course of his career. That has not been the case so far to start the year. He maybe hasn't been the most aggressive of AD carries, but the team is definitely willing to invest a lot into him resource-wise, and that definitely seems to be the direction they want to go. Everybody knows I love Kale as a support. I think he's a top-tier support in the world, and he'll work well with Teddy. I think you just give him more time. And then Bertle and Closer were also good. Bertle basically playing a perfect series, not necessarily gaining resources, but still winning 1v1 in the top lane. And then Closer was good as well. Definitely a little bit over-aggressive, caught out a little bit more than maybe he should have been in some of these circumstances, but most of the time it was entirely worth it. He was still putting out a lot of damage in a lot of these games. So SANDBOX looking pretty good. And then for Nongshim on the other side, I don't know. This is probably the level that this team is going to play at for the rest of the year. Sylvie's going to get my dud of the series. Just got completely out-jungled by Willer, completely taken out of this series. Really, really good stuff from Willer, but Sylvie was definitely at the detriment of that, especially in game number 1. That Viego game was really brutal coming out from him. No pressure, no activity, no anything. His laners were left basically to their own devices, and none of them were really able to keep up either, but at the very least, he could have helped out somebody if he was in the game, but he just was not. That's a problem with Sylvie. That was something we saw a lot from him last split as well, is that when he did get behind, he wasn't particularly good. When this team lost, it was often because he just had no pressure on the map, and that continued here. As mechanically talented as he is, it feels like his early games are incredibly inconsistent, and that's going to continue to cause Nongshim problems throughout the entire split. But it wasn't just him. Vital and Peter got run over in game number 2 on the Aphelios Yuumi. We've been talking about how, the Yuumi is an incredibly strong pick. Even when the Zeri is taken away, it feels like the Yuumi is the stronger of the two, and unfortunately that was not the case here in game number 2 for Nongshim. Vital got run over. The Aphelios was not useful at all. Targeted heavily by SANDBOX. Teddy was definitely the better AD carry in this series, and Peter really wasn't able to get anything done on the Yuumi. If you're behind and your carries aren't doing anything, it's not really a great situation to be in. Quad really wasn't getting anything done. I was saying Closer got picked off. Quad also got picked off a lot, especially early on in some of these team fights, and Din was just not as good on the top side of the map playing the tanks. And so for Nongshim, there is upside to this team. We saw that in the Bro series, but they're not going to immediately be a top 7 or 8 team overnight. Like, them beating what is probably the worst team in the league right now is certainly a good sign that they are not the worst team in the league, but there are still some major issues with this team, and I think a lot of them stem from them not really having any idea how to play from behind. And then for SANDBOX on the other side, good win. It's definitely what you wanted to see, but it doesn't change my opinion. This team continues to look like the gatekeepers of the bottom 4, and I imagine it will look like that until they are proven otherwise. Obviously, there are some teams like KDF that could potentially be interesting threats down the line for them, but SANDBOX looking pretty good right now and definitely looking like a bottom-tier playoff team. Then moving on to our second series here of day number 4, and it's another rather intriguing matchup between two lower-tier teams. We have a matchup between the Kwangdong Freecs and okay, BRION, that KDF is going to be able to take in 2 games, completing their first week with a 4-0 record. That's pretty darn good here for a team that I don't think a lot of people considered in the upper echelon of teams. Yes, it's against some of the weaker teams in the league, DRX and Bro, but still 4-0 is strong, and it's a really good start for a young team that is looking to continue to grow together, and that's exactly what they are doing. We talked about the first series really being solid for KDF and the fact that they were able to win through top and bot and not necessarily need their star mid. Well, Bulldog said, I want to get in on that party too. I want to show people that I'm still the player everybody thought I could be, and you know what? He absolutely did that in this series. He's going to get my player of the series here. Bulldog was a lot of fun to watch. Easily the better mid laner out of the 2 in this series. Karis was just not able to kind of hold up, I guess you could say, and we'll talk about that a bit more when we get to the Bro side, but Bulldog, when he wins just as hard as anybody in the league. We saw the Jace be pulled out in game 1, did a really good job exposing that pressure in game number 1 and being able to create a lot of options for the rest of his team, mostly Dudu in that top lane. And then game 2 on the Ahri. I mean, that's really what it was, right? It was a fantastic game 2. A lot of damage, a lot of pressure, a lot of CC. That champion can be so difficult to play into when operated by a really good player like Bulldog is, and I think he definitely showed that off. If he continues to grow, he's going to continue to be one of the most interesting prospects in the LCK. Now, can KDF kind of build around him? That's really going to be the question. Right now, there are some interesting pieces. Like I said earlier this week, Dudu is consistently underrated by the community as a whole. He's been nothing but a good top laner at this level for quite a long time, and he had another very good series here, even with Morgan, kind of his counterpart on the other side. I compare these two a lot as players because I actually think they're very similar. I think Dudu's slightly better, but even with Morgan having a relatively good game number 2 here, Dudu was definitely the better top laner, I would say, in this series. And when these 2 solo laners step up, this team actually is very competitive. Clearly, these 2 solo laners are just going to be better than everybody else in the bottom 4. That has basically been proven at this point, but are they going to be able to do that against some of the top teams in their current form? It's definitely a possibility. And then Taiyun and June, they've been stable. That's all they really need to be. They just don't need to be the worst players in the game. If they're not the worst players in the game, then they're probably going to be good enough for the rest of this team to be able to do something. Now, is that going to be able to hold up again against bot lanes that aren't Paddock and Henna and, you know, these weaker AD carries in the region? That I do not know, but already it's better than what it was in spring, even just through the first 2 series. This is some of the best that we've seen this KDF bot lane perform throughout all of 2023, so that is a good sign overall. And then Gen.G was fine as well. Again, Prio on the volley bear, certainly something interesting that we see here in the LCK, but Gen.G was fine. Overall, KDF just looked pretty complete in this series, and then Bro kind of looked the opposite. This is almost certainly the worst team in the LCK at the current moment, and that's not really all that surprising. This team very much lacks talent. They have decent players. Morgan in particular, I think, is a decent player, and he performed well in game number 2, but nobody else on this team excites me. I know there are still a lot of UMT fans out there, but really, I think they're hanging on to a couple of games. When you look at the overall story of his splits, it's been like, oh, he's got 2, 3, 4 really good games of the season, and then just completely disappears for everything else. I think that's pretty much always been the case. I saw someone on Reddit say that you could still put him onto a top team and he would be or like a contending team, a top 6 team, and he would be a positive. I completely disagree. I think he's a bottom 2 jungler in the league at the current moment, and I don't really see a ton of room for improvement in that respect. But my dud of the game, or my dud of the series, I should say, is going to go to Karis in the mid lane. Just got outplayed by Bulldog basically at every single opportunity. Is not a good player at this level. Was bad in Series 1, is bad now in Series 2, was not good in spring. You know, I'll spoil it a little bit here, but Karis and Effort, this is reportedly their last series starting for Bro. It looks like they're getting benched for some members of the Bro Challengers team, and I think that's a great call. I don't know if they're good. I'll be doing some film review over the course of the next few days to try and figure out what I think of these players and what they've been able to do at the Challengers level, but Karis and Effort are just not good enough to be playing at the LCK level right now, and they're really dragging down Bro. Karis was a problem. Effort really didn't do anything on 2 games of Yuumi, which is never going to be a good thing, and Henna had some moments, especially in that game 2 on Aphelios, but outside of that, like, he was really a non-factor across this entire series, and so really for Bro, just an unspectacular team that doesn't really have any sort of upside. There's a lot of not talent on this team, not a lot of talent on this team, I guess I should say, and not a lot of upside. I don't really see a world in which they end up becoming anything like a top 7, top 8 team in the league. It really just feels like they're kind of destined to be the worst team in 2023. And then KDF on the other side, they've got upside. They do have the upside. Now, the consistency is yet to be proven. Again, they've only beaten teams that are really struggling at the current moment, but really, really like the solo lane duo, and if the bot lane can just be solid, that's going to be good enough for this team to probably be top 7 guaranteed, which is really what they feel like right now. But especially with a team like Hanwha or a team like SANDBOX not necessarily having complete control over that top 6, I do actually think that with a couple more games, a little bit more improvement coming out, KDF could potentially jump into that playoff spot. That's going to bring us to our 5th and final day here in the LCK in week number 1, and we closed out the week with a couple of intriguing matchups. The first one being a matchup between DRX and Dplus KIA that DK is going to be able to take in 3 games. There were a couple of bumpy moments here for DK, who absolutely should have come out on top in this series, but at the end of the day, they were able to get the job done, and that's what matters in the end. A couple of good performances coming in from DRX, but DK just outskilling them, and a lot of it coming in a very similar way to what happened a lot of spring, especially towards the beginning of that split, and that means through the bot lane, who just played incredibly well. I mean, incredibly well in this series. My player of the series has to go to Deft. Really wasn't particularly close. Obviously, the Draven Pike game in Game 1 was a lot of fun to watch, but really, he's getting this for the Zeri game in game number 3. I don't want to do my full rant on here because it's a little bit annoying, but I know a lot of people like to discredit anybody who plays Zeri's, prowess just because they're playing that champion, but the champion's not an auto win. Like, I don't know where that perception comes from. The champion can be beaten and you still have to execute on her. Yes, she has a lot of tools and there are a lot of ways to keep yourself in a good position, but like, you can still mess up on Zeri. Like, it's not impossible to lose on that champion. We've seen it quite a bit. We've seen it quite a bit this week in this video already. And so for Deft to have played game 3 so cleanly and so expertly, it just goes to show you the level that he is currently operating at. In my opinion, he's playing better right now than he has in the last couple of years, including when he won the World Championship last year, individually at the very least. His performances are a little bit more standout-ish, in my opinion, and for that, DK's really, really going to prosper because, like we said, Canyon and Showmaker started off the season really hot in their first series. They were pretty good in this one as well. Canyon, in particular, I thought had another really solid series, but if Deft and Kellen step up and can be these big power points on the map, can dominate 2v2 like they really did all of spring, and then really be big factors towards the back half of the game as well, like, DK is going to be one of the more interesting teams in the entirety of the LCK. So good stuff from Deft. You got to give credit to Kellen as well. The Pike game in game 1 was fun. The Lulu, very impactful in game number 3. It's obviously tough to talk about, the Lulu being like an incredible game changer, but Kellen is a world-class support, and he continued to prove that here. Canyon, like I said, had a really good series. That game 1 Scion jungle was insane. Certainly not something that's being busted out everywhere across the world right now. Just a Canyon pick that I guess he wanted to try. DRX does match it with the Nautilus in the next game, but, the Scion is definitely the more intriguing pick, in my opinion, there, and Canyon played it really, really well. I thought his Viega was also pretty solid. Showmaker was good, setting up a lot of plays for the rest of his team, and then Kano was a little bit outplayed in the top lane. We'll get to DRX in a second. Rascal actually had a really good series here, which is really good to see from him as somebody who I think has really struggled across 2023, but, Kana, I think, will be fine. He was somebody who had some bad games last split as well, but for the most part was a positive for the team overall. Kind of reminds me of the effect that a player like Kingin or Doran has on their teams. Just a solid player isn't necessarily going to change the fate of their team, but is more than good enough to be able to survive. As for DRX on the other side, like I said, Rascal was trying to 1v9 in this series, and I do appreciate him for that. Obviously, it can be a relatively difficult task. I see the narrative, though, shifting quite a bit around him when it comes to DRX. A lot of people saying that he should be put on a top team. I've even seen people go as far as saying he should replace someone like Doran on Gen.G. I'm going to have to call full stop to that. I'm maybe the biggest Rascal fan in the world. Remember, at the beginning of last year, I was calling him one of the best top laners in the world, period, full stop, on KT Rolster. But let's not get our selective memories twisted here. There was a good 4-week stretch in spring where he was, like, objectively the worst top laner in the entire league. Let's not pretend like he's just been hard stuck on this DRX team. He is a big reason why they struggled so much in spring. Now, maybe it's mental, maybe it's seeing the rest of his teammates not perform well. It's just really good to see him in a much better form, at least in this series. Is it going to be sustainable? I don't know. I sure hope it is, but he was easily the best player on DRX in this particular series. Dud of the series for me, though, is going to go to Krako. He's just not been good for DRX. I know a lot of people really want to see Juhan, and I understand that. Juhan wasn't particularly good in spring, but Krako wasn't particularly good in spring either. It really didn't feel like there was a good answer. I would definitely say Juhan was better, but like it wasn't by a lot. He certainly wasn't a good player, and they certainly weren't winning with him. It was just a little bit of a different style, but Krako's just way too aggressive for a team that is not going to be following up with him. Now, Paddock and Kiehu are interesting pieces. I do think that there is something there, especially Paddock, who is really aggressive, but he's got to figure out how to rein in some of those mistakes. We were worried about that at the beginning of the year. It continues to be a little bit of an issue, and I thought Kiehu was a lot better in this second series here, even going into Showmaker, but he also didn't have nearly as big of a role in terms of what he was supposed to do. He was more of the facilitator for the rest of this comp, and so DRX just kind of putting themselves in a position where, you know, Rascal was doing well, and nobody else on the team was really doing all that much. They can win games like this. It is possible, but they're not going to be competitive if this is the answer, and honestly, I don't know if you can expect Rascal to continue to be a 1v9 kind of carry on this team. He absolutely has the talent to do so, and he's done it in the past, but again, if spring is something to go off of, he's going to have a midseason slump when the rest of this team isn't picking up their slack, so that's something to keep in mind. But for now, even if these games were fun to watch, especially that game number 3, it definitely felt like they were a couple of pieces off from being able to compete here. And then for DK on the other side, Deft is playing awesome, Kellen is playing awesome, Canyon feels in form, and Showmaker certainly doesn't feel out of form. There are a lot of positives for this DK team. There's a reason I felt they were going to bounce back here in summer, and I think they've done so. Obviously, this more so felt like a later spring performance because they actually were tested a bit by DRX, which is not something that I think you want to see out of DK, but at the end of the day, you know, they still were competitive in this series, and I think that's all that really matters. A lot of their players stepped up, and they were able to take it in the end. The important parts were hit, and I think at the end of the day, if you're a DK fan, you're going to be pretty happy to walk away with that being the case. And that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here, in our final series of day number 5, and it is a good one. It's a rematch of the spring split finals here in the LCK. We saw Gen.G taking on T1. And just like in those spring finals, Gen.G is going to be able to come out on top. A massive win for this team, avenging their loss at MSI here to T1 with another win domestically. This is basically exactly what you wanted to see out of Gen.G. They took everything that they needed to do and they executed it basically perfectly. A couple of things that I'm going to bring up. A little bit of a warning here for those who don't like to hear a bunch of rants. This is going to be a rant version. If you've made it this far in the video, if you've gotten to the final section here, the final series, this is going to be a little bit of a personal rant from me on the community kind of surrounding things because I just need to put this out there somewhere. I usually save these for Twitter, but you know, it's important enough to me to say this in a video that I'm going to do it now. So let's go ahead and talk about Zeri, shall we? Let's talk about Zeri. Let's talk about Yuumi. Let's talk about the culture surrounding this pick. I am so tired of opening up Reddit to get an idea of what the community is looking at because I have to. I try to, when I watch these videos, to get an idea of what the community thinks or what is a popular opinion amongst people so that I can see whether or not I agree or disagree. You'll see me often bringing up, you know, whether I agree or disagree with a lot of takes on this channel. And so I try to have a decent idea of where popular opinion, public opinion tends to stand on a lot of these players. And so I tend to go to social media for that. But man, if I have to read one more response, comment on any of these about how player doesn't matter, about how you could plug anybody in and they'll win with Zeri or they'll win with Yuumi, I'm gonna throw up because it is so clearly not true. Like, it is so clearly not the case. I understand that as a community, we constantly have to find something to complain about, whether it be Zeri now, or a Felios a couple of years ago, or a Kali before that, or the boringness that was Azir. Like, I get that the community at all points in time has to have something that they're mad about, or else they'll just explode. Their brains can't handle not being mad for 2 seconds. I understand that that is the case, but do people not understand the hypocrisy that comes with people complaining about how stale the meta is while posting the same thing in every post-match thread every single game? Like, do people not understand or comprehend the problem that lies within that? So yes, I think Pei's played really well here. He's going to get my player of the series. I know Zeri is a really strong champion. I'm not trying to underplay her power. She's the best AD carry in the game, but we've had great AD carries before, and Zeri is just one of them. Quite frankly, I'd rather it be Zeri than frickin' Jinx or Jin or Ashe, or this meta where all you do is auto-attack. At least Zeri has to play the game. I understand that she's overloaded right now, and that Triforce is an incredibly broken item, and that she shouldn't be dealing nearly as much damage as she is building Triforce into, you know, Titanic Hydra or whatever she ends up building, but there absolutely could be worse. Again, I don't want it to come across like I'm a Zeri defender, like I'm trying to say that, you know, the state that she's in is good for the game or anything like that, or that she doesn't need a nerf. I do think she needs a nerf, but pretending like it's the only conversation to have surrounding any game, specifically one between two of the best teams in the entire world, go to the post-match thread. It's only Zeri. No one's talking about any of the players. No one's talking about how the teams are going to be moving into the future. There's no conversation. It just ruins all discussion surrounding pro play, and so, sorry for the rant, but Paze played really well, and it's not just the champion. You put Hanwha in this series, Gen.G doesn't win. You have to have a player like Paze to be able to maximize Zeri. It's almost like we saw Zeri 100 times this week, and she lost almost 50% of those, because if you're not the better ADC, you can't maximize the things that Zeri makes easy, I guess you could say, or makes strong, right? So credit to Paze. Paze is awesome. I'm really excited to see him have a really good series player of the series for me. That Zeri in Game 3 was spectacular. Maybe he doesn't get to do that on a different champ, but, you know, you also don't get to do that if you're not Paze, and so it kind of is a two-way street in that respect. So Paze gets my player of the series. Really, really awesome stuff from him. He wasn't the only one who played well across this entire series, but he certainly was the one that I think stood out the most. Doran was really good in Game 1 and then completely ran it in Games 2 and 3, so there's something with that. I understand people dislike Doran. That's kind of a popular opinion. Not necessarily so in my comment section. I've seen a lot of my comment section be pretty high on him as a player, and I'm kind of somewhere in the middle, I think, of like public opinion and then my comment section, where I think he's a good player. He's like a top 3 or 4 top laner in the LCK. Not a game breaker, certainly not someone I would expect you to be able to play around if you're a top team, but you could do a lot worse in the top lane than a player like Doran, and I think he kind of showed that off in the series, both the good and the bad. Peanut and Chovy were fine. Chovy had a couple of uncharacteristic mistakes, a lot of deaths in this series, a lot of stepping up and dying for no reason. I definitely think Faker was a little bit more controlled in terms of what he was giving, but Chovy still had a lot of good plays, but really it came down to Paze in those final fights being able to carry it across the finish line for Gen.G. As for T1 on the other side, couple of good things, couple of bad things. My dud of the series is actually going to go to Owner in the jungle. I think that he had a couple of really good moments. That Game 2 on the Viego obviously was really strong, and I thought he played well, and he had some moments in Game 3, but honestly, most of Game 1 and then towards the back end of Game 3 were just really bad from him, and honestly, he's kind of been the worst performing member of this team to start the split. I thought Zeus would have been that, but he was really good in this series, probably the most consistent member of T1. I know his scoreline, again, doesn't necessarily show that. He didn't have a perfect game number 1, but his Games 2 and 3, he was just better than Doran, and he did a lot in those matchups. Really impressed with him there. Guma had a couple of really good moments. Carry is obviously going to be mostly a positive for the team, and Faker was rather consistent, but at the end of the day, they just couldn't team fight their way out of this equation. This was a really close series, a really fun game number 3 that I think is overshadowed by kind of the narrative that surrounds all of League of Legends right now, with the pessimism and the black and white thinking and the extremes. The game is either perfect or it's awful, and the game will never be perfect kind of thinking. And so, you know, it is what it is, but T1, I think, definitely put up a fight, and it was an interesting series, to say the least. And then for Gen.G on the other side, they are the best team in the LCK as of right now. They've won 2 of 3 series against T1. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe Gen.G is that team that can go on and compete for the World Championship. Obviously, they've still got a long season to show a lot of these things off, but this is about as good of a start as you can get in order to get to that spot. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCK Week 1 overview and analysis. Up on the screen, you're going to see the updated LCK standings after the first week of action. Of course, any ties will just be broken alphabetically, but you're going to see the teams ordered in terms of their results. In the first column to the right, you're going to see the updated power rankings that I have after week number 1. And in the second column, you're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week. So let's go ahead and go over the biggest risers and the biggest fallers. And there's really not a lot of changes this week. I feel like pretty much everything went according to plan. A lot of these teams are very similar to what we thought they would be going into the split. And so I don't want to make any drastic changes, I guess, without really a lot of reason to. The big change changes are going to be at the top and the bottom of the power rankings, though, with Gen.G leaping T1 back into that #1 spot. They were the spring champions, and now they defended their crown here in the LCK. They're going to have that #1 spot until they prove that they're more inconsistent than that, and T1 is going to fall down to #2. I still see these teams very interchangeably at the current moment, though, and so numbers 1 and 2 I don't think are all that important. They're the 2 top teams in the league. That's pretty clear. And then number 9 and 10 are going to swap. Nongshim going to jump ahead of Bro. Bro looks like the worst team in the league right now. It's not particularly close. Nongshim being able to pick up a win over them is important, but I still don't trust this team enough to move them above anybody else in the standings. You may wonder why a team like Hanwha Liiv or a team like DRX aren't moving down. Hanwha lost to 2 of the best teams in the league, the Telecom brothers, KT Rolster, T1, 2 of the top 3 teams in the league. Very difficult start to the schedule, and I still believe that they'll be better than the bottom half of the league. And then DRX, I just don't know if they're going to be worse than Nongshim. They've shown a couple of decent things. Rascal playing at a decent level right now, and I think the young players are explosive enough to give me the confidence that they should stay there. But let me know what you guys think. Do you guys disagree? Do you think some of these teams should have moved up or moved down? Let me know down in the comment section below. Of course, it's time to get into my player of the week and my dud of the week in week #1 here. And my player of the week is very excitedly going to go to Dudu, the top laner for the Kwangdong Freecs. Really excited to give that to him. I feel like this is a player who has consistently been very undervalued and underrated by a lot of analysts, but it's hard to underrate him anymore. He's stepping up. He's been a good focal point for KDF, and he's been a top laner in this league. He was the best player, in my opinion, in week #1, especially going up against the competition that he did, and I definitely feel he deserves that award. As for my dud of the week in week #1, it's going to go to Effort on Bro. I just don't think Effort was very good. Obviously, him and Karis are both getting replaced. I think you could have realistically given this award to either of them, but I'm going to go ahead and give it to Effort. It feels like he really is just a hindrance for his team and doesn't really offer a lot of positives. I think that Bro is going to be better now that they're moving on with a new mid laner and a new support. Even if they're not better immediately, at the very least, they're moving in a different direction, because I don't think having Effort there is going to give you a ton of upside, as we saw here in week #1. So my dud of the week in week 1 is going to go to Effort, and my player of the week is going to go to Dudu, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to the channel. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We're going to be covering the LCK every single week on this channel. Of course, we don't only cover the LCK. We cover all 4 of the major regions, as well as the NACL weekly on this channel. So if you're interested in that, hit that subscribe button. I promised if you enjoyed this video, you'll probably enjoy the rest of them as well. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all